Good evening, everyone. And welcome to our event tonight on academic freedom in an age of conformity with guest speaker Joanna Williams. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm professor of religion and philosophy at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute that is sponsoring this event tonight. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to help shape America's future by cultivating in students a knowledge and a passion for public affairs. The Institute encourages free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive dialogue among those with different values and contending points of view. Established at St. Olaf in 2014, the Institute offers a distinctive opportunity to cultivate civil discourse about contentious issues within the context of a liberal arts setting. For indispensable help in organizing our event tonight, special thanks go to Shannon Regier, the Institute's administrative assistant, and Christopher Moore, newly appointed assistant director. Thanks also to Associate Director of Marketing, Kari Vanderveen, Assistant Director of Project Management, Andrea Galswick, Director of Events Management, Aida Mahia, and Associate Director of Events Management, Brianne Jans. Thanks to Director of Broadcast and Media Services, Jeff O'Donnell and his entire crew, to former Provost of the College, Jim May, to the Hamiltonians, a group of second-year students who assist the Institute. Thanks finally to the students in the Public Affairs Conversation program and to a group of faculty who have spent a good bit of time and energy over the last week reading and discussing vigorously, but civilly, the work of Joanna Williams on academic freedom. Our speaker, Joanna Williams, is an academic and author and education editor for the British online magazine Spiked. She has a PhD from the University of Kent's Department of Sociology and Social Policy. Her graduate research involves sociological and political analysis of UK national education policies. She has taught in United Kingdom schools and higher education for more than 20 years. Most recently, she was senior lecturer in higher education and academic practice at the University of Kent, where she was also program director of the MA in higher education and director of the Center for the Study of Higher Education between 2014 and 2016. Since 2016, Williams has worked part-time at the university in order to pursue a variety of writing projects. She is the author of 2 books on higher education, Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, published in 2016, and Consuming Higher Education, Why Learning Can't Be Bought, published in 2012. Her latest book, Women versus Feminism, Why We All Need Liberating from the Gender Wars, will be published next month. She has also written numerous articles on higher education, academic freedom, and feminism. As I have read and pondered and discussed the work of Joanna Williams on academic freedom, I have been reminded of the famous line from the old comic strip, Pogo. We have met the enemy, and he is us. Joanna Williams prizes academic freedom as a condition of the search for truth, a search that in her view ought to be at the very heart of the academic enterprise. But she worries that academic freedom is seriously threatened in contemporary American and British colleges and universities. Academic freedom is threatened today, according to Williams, not primarily by the church or religion, as it has been threatened by the church or religion at certain points in history. Academic freedom is threatened today, according to Williams, not primarily by the state, as it has been threatened by the state in certain moments of the past. Neither is academic freedom, according to Williams, centrally threatened these days, as sometimes it has been threatened by wealthy benefactors of colleges and universities. No, according to Williams, We have met the enemy, and he is us. For Joanna Williams, the primary threat to academic freedom in our time comes from the academy itself. Academic freedom, in her account, is threatened today predominantly by professors, by college and university administrators, and yes, by students who have created, she thinks, a culture of conformity that stifles critical inquiry, rewards self-censorship, and punishes reasonable dissent. From her book, I quote, "Restrictions on academic freedom that emerge from within universities are more insidious than externally imposed legislation. They are less easily recognizable and often stem from well-intentioned students or colleagues rather than heavy-handed managers. Such restrictions can take the form of speech codes, anti-harassment policies, codes of conduct, safe space initiatives, equality and diversity statements, or even, ironically, policies on academic freedom." End of quotation. Joanna Williams' thesis is controversial, provocative, and stimulating. It has already made for vibrant conversation, debate, and critical reflection at our college. We are glad Joanna Williams can be with us tonight to enter our conversation by presenting her argument to us in person. Would you please join me in welcoming Joanna Williams to speak on the topic of academic freedom in an age of conformity.
Thank you, Edmund, and thank you very, very much to the Institute for Freedom and Community for inviting me, and thank you all very much for coming here this evening. I think it's really admirable and truly great to be able to discuss academic freedom because it's such a hot topic at the moment, as I'm sure you're all aware, within academia. But I think it's really useful to be able to discuss it away from the emotion of some blow-up event and to be able to carefully consider the issues, taking an intellectual and emotional step back to look at the broader context of the debates. So I'm truly honoured to be able to be here this evening and take part in that conversation. I want to begin a little bit unusually in a way that I've never begun a speech before by just saying a little bit about my own background, my own political background, just to give you some context as to where I'm, the position from which I'm approaching this issue. So I'm from the UK, as you can tell from my accent, and I grew up in a small northeastern town called Middlesbrough, a very industrial northeastern town. And Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of the UK when I was 6 years old. And by the time I was 16 years old, Middlesbrough was no longer an industrial town. It was still in the northeast, but it was no longer an industrial town. All the industry had gone, so the chemical plants, the steel works, the shipbuilding, everything had gone. And my father, just like every other adult male that I came into contact with in my life at that time, lost his job. And I think that really had a very formative influence on my life as I was growing up as a child. And it very firmly put me on the side of the left in political terms. I blamed Margaret Thatcher personally for my father losing his job, and I still haven't forgiven her. So I was very, very much on the left politically, and I looked to join a number of left-wing organisations, starting with the Labour Party. I got bored with that, moved on to the Socialist Party, and got a bit bored and disappointed with that. And when I was at university, I joined the Revolutionary Communist Party, and I spent most of my 3 years as an undergrad in the United Kingdom selling Living Marxism magazine. And Edmund made reference to Spiked Online, which is the magazine which I'm education editor for, and Spiked emerged quite directly out of Living Marxism. Incidentally, it's worth pointing out that it emerged from Living Marxism not because we wanted to close Living Marxism down, but some of you may be aware that the UK has very strong libel laws which act to restrict free speech. Living Marxism magazine was sued for libel, and even though the judge in the case agreed that all the facts were as Living Marxism magazine had presented them in this particular case, the nature of the libel laws meant that the magazine essentially went bankrupt, and so Spiked emerged very directly from Living Marxism. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this is because one of the things that upsets me most today is the thought that free speech should be considered a right-wing concern, a right-wing issue. If you argue in favour of free speech today, well, people have said to me quite directly that this is a conspiracy to smuggle in right-wing politics through the back door, that if you are arguing for free speech or arguing for academic freedom, then you are automatically assumed to be on the political right. And for me personally, that's absolutely not the case. I argued for free speech, and I thought academic freedom and free speech were very, very important when I was selling Living Marxism and a member of a revolutionary communist party, and I absolutely still maintain those principles today. And I certainly have no secret plan to kind of smuggle right-wing politics in through the back door. Anyway, that's enough about me directly. So I want to talk about academic freedom in an age of conformity. I'm slightly nervous to talk about this book, mainly because I wrote the book in the first half of 2015, and I'm slightly worried that there are some people in the room who are probably more familiar with the book now than I am, and will be able to correct me if I get anything wrong in my own book. I'm also slightly anxious about talking about it because, having written the book in the first half of 2015 and then sent it off to the publishers, as you do, and there was a considerable time period before the book was actually published. It came out early 2016, so kind of 6 months passed between me kind of hitting send and it actually seeing the light of day. And even in that 6-month period, it seemed that the debates had moved on so much, and it kind of felt like some of the issues I was writing about were already slightly out of date, and the examples that I could have picked if I'd been writing the book 6 months later, I'd have had so many more things to be able to draw upon. And I'm sure people who were reading the book were kind of thinking, oh, well, why didn't she mention this? Why didn't she mention that? And that time period, so much has been happening. And of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, still is. So this evening, what I really want to do is to look at how I think things have changed a little bit, how I think the debate has moved on in the intervening couple of years, and particularly think about how my thinking has moved on in relation to the topic of academic freedom. But I do want to do this very much in the context of the arguments that I've put forward in my book. I'm also hoping, and I've asked Edmund to give me a little signal. I am hoping to leave plenty of time for question and answers. And so if people have got questions that relate more directly to issues that I cover in the book but don't talk about this evening, then I'm very, very happy to speak to those in the Q&A. So in Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, I tried to set out some of the intellectual context that I think, particularly within social science and humanity faculties, has all but put an end to the pursuit of truth as a goal of higher education. It's kind of really interesting this morning. I got the good fortune to have a look around the Kierkegaard Library, and there's a section of the library which is dedicated to books by people who've been influenced by Kierkegaard. And I happened to pick up a book by Karl Jaspers on the purpose of a university. And the very, very first line of that book is the university is an institution committed to the pursuit of truth. And you just think, wow, who nowadays would have the confidence to really be able to assert that as the goal of a university? So we've just been talking about goals of employability, goals of social inclusion, political goals, and there seems to be so many demands on education nowadays. And to be able to just say boldly and simply, a university is committed to the pursuit of truth is kind of phenomenally confident, it strikes me. But I'm, as Edmund intonated in his introduction, I'm trying to rehabilitate that idea. I think that's a fine idea. But what I argued in the book was that knowledge has effectively, it seems to me, too much nowadays been reduced to ideology, or in other words, it's become accepted that knowledge is simply a product of the economic and political conditions that have given rise to it. And this denies, effectively, the possibility of objectivity or any truth in knowledge beyond the exposure of the workings of power. So by the end of the 1970s, I think that Foucault's dictum, that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, that there is no truly universal truth, had really gained broad attraction among a new breed of anti-universalist and anti-Enlightenment academics. When scholarship was connected to goals of truth and objectivity, and I think this is really important in terms of how my thinking has advanced in this area, the separation of the identity of the individual academic from their work was a fundamental principle of scholarship. So the idea was that you would train your brain almost to go past your first emotional response and to try and look at the word, well, again, a word which I think we certainly in the UK, we hardly seem to use at all nowadays. And if we do use it, it's almost with a degree of derision, is the word disinterested. I'm absolutely not uninterested, but disinterested. And the idea that you would have a disinterested pursuit of scholarship has really gone out of fashion. So today, rather than demanding that every subjective element be eliminated, it's assumed too often that objectivity is a myth. And instead, what we have is calls for recognition of the subjectivity of the researcher in the research. And one consequence of this is that rather than striving for the universal, and again, I think this has become a dirty word, the idea that there may be things that have universal relevance to all people, all of humanity, even to talk about common humanity, it seems to me sometimes has become quite controversial. Instead of striving for the universal, striving for that which speaks to our common humanity, too often I think now people are limited to their own experiences and restricted to peering in at others. And I think it's when knowledge is reduced to just a matter of perspective, a reflection of dominant power relations, that academic freedom moves from being a universal value necessary for disinterested scholarship to a loaded argument then used to defend it. It becomes perceived, academic freedom becomes perceived as an elitist right, just to defend the interests of already dominant groups. The right-wing plot that I was alluding to earlier. So at a conference on, I'm sure you've heard of this movement for boycott, divestment and sanctions against Israel, at a conference to discuss BDS in Dublin last week, Stephen Salaita, again, I'm sure somebody you've all probably heard of, an academic from the US, he was the keynote speaker. This conference, it was very strange. I think even just the title of the conference was very, very strange because it was a conference on academic freedom, and yet it was also a conference on promoting BDS. Everybody who spoke at the conference, bar one person, everybody who spoke at the conference was arguing in favour of BDS and arguing that boycott, divestment and sanctions was an act of academic freedom rather than a suppression of free speech. But Stephen Salaita, the keynote speaker, he ended his plenary address to the conference. His final line in his speech was that he welcomes the day when we can get rid of academic freedom altogether when Palestine is liberated. So he was very instrumental in his use of academic freedom. I think rarely are scholars so readily and explicitly scathing of academic freedom as Salaita, or so blatantly instrumental and one-sided in its use. And I suppose we should be grateful to Stephen Salaita for this. I think most often what we see today is a rhetorical support for academic freedom and for free speech, but a squeamishness when it's put into practice. And I do think that, well, I'm going to say I think this appears most starkly in students' views on free speech. But before I do want to defend students, because I don't know if you have this expression in the US, but an expression that's caught on in the UK recently is this phrase, Generation Snowflake. I don't know if you have that expression here. And I have to say, it's an expression that I completely loathe. I loathe it for two reasons. The first reason is I think young people today are far, far tougher than they're given credit for. And I also loathe it because I think it lets an older generation of academics, people my age, it lets an older generation of academics off the hook. It kind of says, you know, look, we can step back. This is calls for censorship and restrictions on free speech. This is nothing to do with us. This is this pathetic younger generation that's coming up. And I think that's a really unfair caricature. I think what you see reflected in young people is very much a product of what they've been taught. So yeah, I don't like the Generation Snowflake label, but I think among young people then what you see, much as among an older generation of academics, is a rhetorical support of academic freedom. So I could probably count on the fingers of one hand the number of people who I've met in my life, who I've had conversations with, who have said to me completely upfront, I don't think we should have academic freedom. I don't think we should. I think free speech is a bad idea. What you find in practice is that most people say, I support academic freedom, but, or I really believe in free speech, but. And it's when, as soon as you put the but in there, you kind of negate the belief in academic freedom, as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, the point is very few people say that they hate academic freedom. So on to young people then, and young people's views on free speech. And I have to apologise here because I am using some statistics that have come from the UK, although I think just as I arrived in the US on Monday, there was actually a survey published in, I think it was the Washington Post, but I might be very wrong on that, which really replicated this survey and showed very, very similar results from the US as well. So a study was carried out on UK students in 2016, asking them about their attitudes towards free speech. And this survey showed that just under 10% of students thought universities should actively limit and restrict free speech on campus, above and beyond the law. So 10% thought that universities should play an active role in banning newspapers, banning speakers, restricting free speech. Now, 10% is quite a lot. But it could be worse. You know, 90% presumably thought that universities shouldn't be playing this active role in repressing speech. But what's really interesting about this survey is that even though only 10% thought universities should do this active restricting free speech, 43% of students agreed with the statement that protection from discrimination and ensuring the dignity of minorities can be more important than unlimited freedom of expression. So you see how you're getting two competing ideas being put forward here, free speech on the one hand and inclusivity on the other hand, and these two ideas are being brought into conflict with one another. So just to spell out what I mean here and what the logic of this argument is what it means in practice then is that only 10% of students say universities should actively limit free speech, but 1 in 4 students, and again this is from the UK I'm afraid, 1 in 4 students think that the UK Independence Party should be banned from speaking at university events. So now a little rider here about UK politics. So UKIP, as it's known, UK Independence Party, it's a right-wing party and it supports Britain leaving the EU, the European Union, and it argues in favour of tighter immigration controls. Its one-time leader, Nigel Farage, is big pals with your President Trump and has been on kind of visits here and had his photo taken outside the Golden Elevator with his thumbs up. Now, UKIP is not a party that I would personally support. It's not, I could never, ever imagine myself voting for this party. But it's not considered to be an extreme party. It's not a neo-fascist party. At the 2015 general election, UKIP won the backing of 12.5% of voters, making it the third biggest party in the UK. Its representatives are regularly appearing on the BBC, and the BBC it does not deliberately go around looking for right-wing commentators. It's not the same as Fox News or anything like that. So this is a very right-wing but mainstream right-wing party. And yet 1/4 of students are saying that there is no place on campus for the views that 12.5% of the electorate voted for. So you see, then this is exactly the tension that I'm alluding to, where only 10% of students are saying we want active restrictions on free speech, but a quarter are saying this political party that's a fairly mainstream political party won 12.5% of the vote. This is beyond the pale. This would cause untold damage if speakers were allowed to appear on campus, and it must be banned from campus. So you've got this conundrum then. Why is it that so many students are quick to outlaw views that they disagree with from campus? And in my book, I point to, as many of you know, the kind of the assumption that language constructs reality, that words do more, essentially, than just connote ideas and summon up arguments, but are actually an expression of power relations. And as such, the words themselves, the language that's used, can create a hostile environment and threaten people, particularly people in minority groups. And I think we see this even more explicitly today, and particularly since Brexit in the UK, Trump in the US, this equation of words with violence and the subsequent, and I think actually very, very frightening to me, blurring of a distinction between linguistic violence and actual physical violence. Indeed, I'd go further, and I would say that nowadays, the idea that words can wound, the idea that words can inflict psychic harm on people, that's actually seen as being more damaging, particularly to vulnerable individuals, than physical harm. So when I was young, I mean, this is really how old I am, there was a kind of popular playground rhyme that said, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me." And that was what you're supposed to retaliate if anybody called you a name. And nowadays, it seems we've almost come completely full circle, where the accepted idea is that sticks and stones can break my bones, great, I'll heal in a year's time. But if you use words, then the violence and the damage that does to me, the psychic harm, will last me a lifetime. And the determination to shut down speakers then who are deemed likely to inflict psychic harm, and this is what worries me, it seems to provide the basis for actual physical violence, as we've seen played out, sadly, at campuses such as Berkeley, Middlebury, Evergreen. And I think that's a really disturbing development. But this academic view of language, truth, and knowledge that I've been referring to in my book, I don't think that need automatically lead to demands for censorship. And I think, in all honesty, if I was writing this book again today, I think I would probably spend just as much time looking at something else that I think goes hand in hand with this view of language to make censorship as something that's actively called for. And I think the thing that I would give much more attention to if I was rewriting the book today is the idea of individuals as vulnerable. And I think this is an idea which has completely escalated in the past couple of years. And today it seems to me that almost every student can be labelled as vulnerable in some way, in one way or another. It seems that all women students on campus are presented as victims of rape culture. In the UK, working class students are said to need special officers to induct them into the ways of a university. Black and minority ethnic students are said, again, many UK universities, to need safe spaces. LGBTQ students are said to need segregated housing. But I think more than anything else, there seems to be a perception that students are mentally vulnerable. So according to one particular poll in the UK, 1 in 4 students is said to suffer from a mental health problem. The NUS, the National Union of Students in the UK, places this figure even higher. It suggests that 78%, or almost 4 out of every 5 students, has a mental health issue. Now, I'm not standing here for one moment saying that mental health problems are not real. They are, they need to be taken seriously, and certainly all reports seem to suggest that depression, anxiety, and stress are on the increase. However, I think when we come to see almost 80% of students as having a mental health problem, I think we need to look a little bit closer at what's going on. And I think it may be the case that some everyday experiences of being a student, worrying about exams and essay deadlines, struggling with budgeting, friendship, living away from home for the first time, have become interpreted not as a normal part of growing up, but as mental health problems that people need particular professional help and a range of therapeutic interventions to help them deal with. And I think it's the consequence of this perception of students as vulnerable that leads to the demand for protection for emotional well-being. And when we come to see protecting students' emotional well-being as being something very, very important, then censorship, it becomes more than just an act of kindness. Censorship actually becomes far more crucially about safety. And who would want to put students in a dangerous position? So I think it's very much these two developments going hand in hand, the blurring of a distinction between words and violence on the one hand, and at the same time understating the resilience of individuals. And I think it's these two things acting in conjunction with one another that provides the momentum behind curbs on free speech, and it particularly leads to the self-censorship that I kind of get to in my book. I just want to give one example of how these two things going hand in hand together plays out in practice and produces self-censorship. And this is with the issue of trigger warnings. I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of a trigger warning, a kind of advance notification of anything that's likely to prompt stress or trauma. And trigger warnings have really taken off in UK higher education in the past year. So they appear in medical courses, so presumably trigger warning blood, or forensic science courses, trigger warning dead bodies, law classes that cover the issue of sexual assault or rape, and perhaps most famously literature classes where students are warned about anything from suicide to violence, racism, sexism, classism. I mean, to my mind, providing students about to read Anna Karenina for the first time with trigger warning suicide is actually a massive plot spoiler. But I think what's worrying and ultimately very, very censorious is the assumption that underpins the trigger warning. So I think there's two principles. And the first is, again, that this issue, that's this idea that students are vulnerable, fragile, and need forewarning about anything that could be potentially unsettling. And the second is that topics and literature, really integral to the course content, can be so traumatic that it could cause psychological problems to students. I think it's probably slightly different here in the US, but in the UK, and you can tell me afterwards, I'd be keen to know, in the UK, students now paying tuition fees at levels not too dissimilar to the rates at which you guys pay, are very much seen as the customers of the university. The customer is always right. Student satisfaction, which we actually measure in surveys and demonstrate in league tables, is of preeminent importance. So academics really want to have satisfied students. And my concern is that with satisfaction being of preeminent importance, trigger warnings encourage academics to self-censor, because if you kind of think in advance that something is so traumatic, it warrants having a trigger warning applied to it, then why would you bother putting your students in the position of making them read it in the first place? And you see this a really good example of this last month. So an academic, her name's Judith Hawley, an academic from Royal Holloway University in London. She became the centre of a national news story for apparently banning the first erotic novel in the English language, Fanny Hill, from her literature course. Now, she came out in the news and she said that she'd been misrepresented, that she hadn't banned the novel at all. And she said in a radio documentary exploring free speech, she said, in the 1980s, I both protested against the opening of a sex shop in Cambridge and I taught Fanny Hill. Nowadays, I would be worried about causing offence to my students. So reasonably enough, then, commentators had drawn the conclusion that the novel had been dropped to protect the students she didn't want to offend. Hawley, on the other hand, so the academic, she argued the book hadn't been dropped because it was never on the syllabus in the first place. Now, well, she went on to explain, she said, when I first taught this text, Fanny Hill, in the 1980s, it seemed important to make sure that the issues the novel raised, including desire, pornography, and power, were discussed in the academic environment. That academic environment has changed. The student body is larger, more diverse, less privileged, and more uncertain about the future. So that was her reason for not including the novel on the syllabus. Now, no university course can possibly cover every book that's ever been written, and academics have to, and I think it's to my mind the most important role that an academic plays, a professor plays, is in making those crucial decisions about what to teach, about constructing that reading list, thinking about what books need to be on there, and leaving a book off a reading list is quite obviously not censorship, it's exercising academic judgment. But my concern is that academic judgment nowadays is too often exercised not with literary or intellectual merit in mind, but, as Hawley herself explained, with a view to the assumed sensibilities of this larger, more diverse, less privileged student body. What she was effectively saying was, my students are coming from a wider social class background, which I have to say I think is brilliant. She's saying, my students are coming from a wider social class background nowadays, and these students can't cope with reading Fanny Hill. I find that very patronising. I find a very, very patronising argument. But what's interesting is that despite all the criticism of Generation Snowflake, no students had been offended by Fanny Hill. No students had been jumping up and down saying, we want this novel banned, this is traumatising us, this shouldn't be taught. They hadn't been given the opportunity. I mean, perhaps there were one or two students there who would have loved the opportunity to have been offended and outraged by Fanny Hill, but they were denied that opportunity. So Hawley did not obviously have government officials or university administrators even telling her that she had to ban this book or not teach this book. It was her assumption about the vulnerability of students and her desire, and this is a quote from her, she said she wanted to avoid being slapped with a trigger warning, and that desire to protect her students and avoid being slapped with a trigger warning meant she self-censored in effect, and she decided to change the content of the curriculum on that basis. I think a similar set of assumptions about the vulnerability of students and the impact of literature underpins the decolonise movement, and that was only just taking off when I wrote Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity. It's a campaign I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with, began with statues and moved very, very quickly to the content of the curriculum. And in the UK, I don't think you have the same slogan here, but in the UK, students campaign under the banner of "Why is my curriculum white?" That's kind of instead of, but the aims and the objectives are very similar to the decolonise movement. I'm sure you're all aware it's Reed College in the United States which made headlines, I think it was just last week or the week before, and the challenge to its core humanities course made the news on both sides of the Atlantic. And it seems today to teach a course that focuses on dead white men marks you out as, at best, a relic from a bygone era, at worst, most likely a white supremacist. So I need to make clear at this point that I do think the decolonise movement and the Why is my curriculum white movement in the UK plays a very, very useful role in prompting us to question what deserves a place on the curriculum. I think asking those questions is very, very important, and I certainly wouldn't stand here saying that we should be teaching students exactly the same material that we taught them 100 years, 200 years ago, and we should never review what students get taught. I think those conversations should be active, ongoing, and should be constantly under review. My concern is on what basis those judgments about the content of a curriculum are made. I do think professors should be able to assert that some texts and some authors are more important to study than others. I think they do so on the basis of their knowledge of the field and their knowledge of the discipline, knowledge, crucially, that their students don't yet have. I also think the argument that decisions about curricular content, decisions about curricular content should be made primarily on gender, skin colour or sexuality of the author in order to produce a kind of tick box curriculum where different identity groups can be checked off is misplaced. I think the suggestion that students can only relate to work by people who look like them is patronisingly racist and sexist. It speaks to a narcissism that places the individual student at the centre of the curriculum rather than a particular body of knowledge. I think this can end up becoming censorious when classes are cancelled and courses are dropped or quietly rewritten, not for academic, but for political motivations. So I think what's driving the use of trigger warnings is the influence of identity politics in the academy, and I think that lies behind much of the decolonised movement as well. And this is something that I only touch upon in my book, this influence of identity politics, and something I want to explore a little bit in more detail now. I'm going to take a particular focus on feminism and gender, because that's the thing I've been most interested in looking at over the course of the past year. Today, you will be aware, I'm sure, that the idea is that there isn't one type of feminism, but there are many different forms of feminism: radical, liberal, black feminism, lesbian feminism, intersectional feminism, and of course the derogatory white feminism. And it seems that the particular label, the particular brand of feminism is all important, not just for describing a political position, but speaking far more intrinsically to a person's sense of identity. And many of these different forms of feminism have emerged not through campaigning outside of academia, but from within the lecture hall, within the seminar room, and it's overflown from the academy to influence the discussion outside of universities. And I think that was quite different in the 60s and 70s. Back in the 1960s, the impact of feminism was first felt in universities as a challenge to the content of the curriculum. So women questioned the composition of the canon in literature and demanded greater representation for women writers. And again, I think this has many interesting and similar parallels with the decolonised movement. It was in effect, I think, very much a demand on universities to fulfill the promise for intellectual universalism, and a demand that courses which had become set in aspic were called into question, were put up for review. I think there was much that was positive about that. It prompted a very useful discussion about literary quality, the taken for granted nature of the canon, and the role of higher education in preserving a national cultural heritage. So I think much to be welcomed there, just as much to be welcomed about the decolonised questioning of the curriculum today. Into the 1970s, feminists within universities brought the second wave lesson that the personal is political into the heart of academic work. And this went beyond then seeking greater representation for women or broadening the topics covered, and prompted a far more fundamental questioning of what counted as knowledge and whose knowledge was being legitimised within the university. So feminist scholars influenced by critical theory argued that existing assumptions about knowledge presented a masculine standard as universal, and patriarchal power relations as fixed. And this view developed within an intellectual climate that was already, as I explain in my book, beginning to question whether the aspiration towards scholarship and truth and objectivity was possible or desirable. So some feminist scholars argued that aiming for objectivity in research was little more than a mask for presenting masculine beliefs, values, and assumptions as universal. So according to this line of argument, women's interests were best served not by better or more objective research, but by abandoning false claims to objectivity and neutrality altogether. And instead, feminists argued for a new epistemology that would position researchers as gendered and situated knowers, where both what is known and significantly the way in which it's known reflects the situation or the perspective of the knower. And this emphasis on standpoint really brought a new subjectivity to academic work. And not only does this bring women's experiences to the fore, but far more confidence for the nature of scholarship, it positions truth as context dependent and dependent upon an individual's perspective. So this is where, and I don't know how big this is in the US, but in the UK, it's very fashionable when people talk about truth in an academic context to go like that and kind of indicate their scare quotes around the word truth. And it's a kind of ironic nod to, well, of course, we all know truth, not real. Or to talk about many truths rather than to talk about truth. So you see we've kind of come full circle now from where I started from. So understanding this idea of truth as multiple and perspectival calls for new kind of research methods to get to the heart of personal experiences and understanding. The idea that academics could give voice, and again that's kind of in little quote marks, this idea that we give voice to groups whose experiences were not previously considered worthy of academic study through narrative, life history, biographical research methods. This became recognised as an important means of allowing women in particular to tell their own stories. But I think what's crucial, I think recognising the subjective element in research is a very worthwhile thing to do. But what's crucial is that recognising the subjective wasn't done with a view to transcending it, to try and recognise it and then look at how we can move beyond the subjective. Instead, as I said earlier, it was with a view to arguing that objectivity was a masculine contrivance, and instead giving voice or storytelling became an end in itself. And this approach to this emphasis on the subjective led in some instances to pedagogical approaches which kind of mimicked the consciousness raising group outside of the classroom. And it was very much the message that these subjective states were of more significance, were more true, if you like, closer to truth than an objective analysis of data. But I think one problem with this then is that educational goals become very easily and very explicitly mixed up with political goals. And indeed, even to talk about separating educational goals from political goals was kind of considered disingenuous. It was considered that you couldn't. Education can't be separated from politics. Education is politics. If you argue it's not, you're just arguing a masculine view that tries to present objectivity and neutrality, but it's just really a pretense for a masculine worldview. So, moving on a little bit, conscious of time, this view that all knowledge is a reflection of its originator challenges the view that men and women, and I think this is the really important bit in relation to identity politics that I want to get to, it challenges the idea that men and women make sense of the world in the same way. It kind of embeds different ways of understanding as being at the heart of academic work. So it argues that knowing is something which is gendered specific. So it's a real challenge to universal ideas of making sense of the world. I said the qualitative and subjective way in which people experience the world is different, therefore their understandings are different too. And that's not something to transcend, that's something which becomes embedded. So, and again, I guess I'll be very, very upfront with you, what I really don't like about this, the bit that gets, and I would argue my feminist hackles rising, although nowadays, it would be challenged by feminists, the bit that gets my feminist hackles rising is this assumption that women have this kind of, that women and men have a specifically gendered consciousness. My fear is that it positions women within a subjective and emotional domain, and my fear is, and please tell me if you think I'm wrong in the Q&A, but my fear is that we run the risk of saying rationality, that's a male domain, the emotional realm, that's a female domain. And like I said, that kind of just doesn't sit easily with me. I think I'm just as capable of being rational as any man. But when we come to accept this view that there's no common or objective reality shared by men and women women alike, it kind of leads to the view expressed by the Australian feminist Dale Spender, as she refers to man-made language, that women are even communicating in a language which has been made by men, and that they need to reclaim language in order to discover their own knowledge. Okay, the next kind of important stage in my argument this evening then, I think it was a very, very short leap from arguing that men and women have different ways of understanding the world to arguing that women's more subjective, more emotional ways of understanding the world were superior. And they were superior because of the experience of subordination. And the experience of subordination gave women a view of the world that was more grounded in sensitivity to the emotional realm, that there's a feminist vantage point that's more illuminating, this is Sandra Harding, than any existing vantage point, that women having experienced reproductive as well as productive labour are able to develop a more objective viewpoint than men who have more restricted experience and this is a quote, more to gain from hiding the truth. I think this is dangerous terrain. I think in locating claims for intellectual insight within an experience of subordination, you're drawing a direct link between oppression and access to knowledge. It becomes women's status as victims of patriarchy that affords them this superior insight. Oppression leads women to develop a superior value system, so the argument goes, and a more finely tuned sense of morality. Feminist consciousness has been described as a consciousness of victimization. I think establishing a link between intellectual insight and oppression is problematic ground because what it does is it commits feminist scholars to maintaining women's status as victims. So with every social and political advance that women make, you're forced then to seek out new sites of inequality, new areas of disadvantage in order to maintain the status of the victim. I think, sorry, again, just skipping on. Traditional feminism became, particularly in moving into the 1980s, 1990s now, traditional feminism criticised for being unable to explain the experience, particularly of imperialism, in relation to the oppression of women in less developed parts of the world and the combined impact of sexism and racism encountered by black women in the West. So black feminists forged a movement that would recognise both race and class as feminist issues which intersected with gender to compound oppression. So this is where we get to ideas around intersectionality, which I'm sure is a word you've all heard before. So this is where issues around feminism then come to intersect with ideas around critical race theory, which were emerging first in legal scholarship and questioning in particular the liberal notion of civil rights. Critical race theory critiqued liberalism for presenting racism as an aberration rather than a normal state of society under white hegemony. Critical race theory and feminism, share an assumption that the lived experience of subordination can best be uncovered, though, through the centering of the subjective and privileging personal narratives in academic research. The rejection of academic objectivity in both instances, I would argue, leads to these avowedly political aims, and the political aims run the risk of taking us away from truth-seeking. They prevent the disinterested pursuit of knowledge. It positions experiential knowledge to the fore. Just as feminism asserts that men and women have no common shared perception of reality, likewise critical race theory, I would argue, assumes that black and white people have no common or shared perception of reality either. The term intersectionality then we've looked at, so I'm conscious of time now. Let's have a look. The theory of intersectionality taken on board by scholars and activists looking to explore not just the intersections of gender, race and class, but also sexuality, age and ability, and all of which are permanent or fixed parts of a person's identity, but might be transient states. But what's important is not that these intersections are simply added together, but instead it's the way that they combine and constitute with each other. So in this way, intersectional feminism maintains a focus on women, while at the same time practicing the key assertion that women are not a homogenous group. Intersectional feminists argue that disabled women, trans women, black women, working class women, and LGBTQ women and white women not only experience the world in different ways, but more importantly, confront multiple layers of intersecting oppression. And the beauty of this, if you like, is that all women can then locate themselves within this prism of oppression, and all women have multiple aspects of identity. Crucially then, feminism that's not intersectional stands accused of ignoring women's overlapping identities and ignoring the impact of how oppression and discrimination play out in relation to each other. So I'm kind of coming to my conclusion now. It's this emphasis on the personal lived experiences of oppression. It's in this way that I kind of have my problem with intersectionality. My concern is that intersectionality constructs a barrier. It constructs an intersectional framework that prevents people from transcending their experiences or even campaigning for liberation on behalf of other people who are not like them. Instead, all of those who are outside of a particular intersection can do is listen and construct their own framework of overlapping oppressions. There's no collective aspiration, no shared political goals that unite all women or far less all of humanity. Intersectionality, I think, holds no promise of liberation from group membership towards the universal category of human. I think on the one hand, you've got no aspiration towards group membership of humanity. At the same time, the group identity obliterates individuality in the assumption that not only all members share a common experience and wish to label themselves accordingly, but also that they share a political outlook, that your skin colour, your gender, your age, your sexuality should determine your political outlook. In focusing on the group, intersectionality elides key differences between people, and my real concern is that biology once again risks becoming the defining features of a person and a causal explanation for social status. So with intersectionality, we have an argument for equality that entrenches biological differences between people as insurmountable. It gives demand to the right that people check their privilege before speaking, or in other words, shut up. And dialogue across intersectional frameworks becomes impossible. And so here I think we see the limits of intersectionality made clear. It demands both ideological and biological purity and returns, as I would argue, to outdated and prejudiced beliefs in differences as naturalised. It ties people into pursuing victimhood associated with their group identity. It undervalues both the universal human experience and at the same time individual freedom and autonomy. Yet in relation to feminism, the absence of a common experience then doesn't signal the end of feminism, but precisely the opposite. A more fractured and contingent what the womanhood becomes, the more it needs to be defined as an identity, as a feeling, as a way of being in the world. So third wave feminism asks us to see woman as a diverse and socially constructed category, constructed out of and in response to a common experience of gender oppression. And what this means in effect is that calling misogyny into question or arguing that women's lives have changed for the better not only challenges the need for feminism, but becomes perceived as actually an attack upon what it means to identify as a woman. But the bind of this intersectional or fourth wave feminism is that identity, particularly identities that are fragile constructs or premised on an experience of oppression, need to be defended with vigilance. And the aim is to get recognition, and recognition from outside authorities for your identity. And I think this is, and I'm not unfortunately going to have time to go into it now, but I think this certainly lies behind two words which, when I started writing Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, I think had barely featured on the radar, but are now everywhere. I think this need to defend an identity gives rise to what we see in relation to microaggressions and debate around microaggressions, and also cultural appropriation. The impact of such campaigns, I think, is to make people ever more defined by gender, sexuality, and skin colour. The act of embodying characteristics that previous generations of activists sought to surpass becomes all-consuming. And the most effective way for any identity group to gain recognition is to stake a claim to victimhood and present themselves as increasingly vulnerable and fragile. And this demand for recognition as a member of an oppressed group is at the heart of calls for campus censorship. In calling for censorship, in claiming your outrage, in claiming how much you are offended, you are defending your identity as a member of an oppressed group. So this drives the call for speakers to be disinvited, for classes to be given trigger warnings, and for texts by dead white men to be removed from the curriculum. So very, very finally now, what concerns me most about attacks on academic freedom that are defined by and driven by demands for recognition is that it allows censorship to be presented, and this is kind of Orwellian, so you have to bear with me. It allows censorship to be defined and presented as its exact opposite. It allows censorship to be presented as a means of promoting free speech. So the idea is that powerful voices need to be closed down in order to allow the oppressed to have their voice heard. Speech needs to be controlled and restricted in order to protect the vulnerable. Now this, I think is hugely problematic. Least of all, who are we asking to make these judgments? Who is it who's this completely objective authority who's deciding who should be able to speak, who's powerful, who's vulnerable, who should be allowed to be heard, who shouldn't? Somebody is asked to play that position of judge. It involves us making assumptions about privilege that are based on gender and skin colour and sexuality, which may not always be the case in reality. It demands that academic freedom moves from being a universal value to one that's applied selectively to some groups of people some of the time. And to my mind, that removes all that's progressive about the demand. It enforces a consensus, encourages political and intellectual conformity in a way that curtails questioning and criticality from the outset. Now, just my very, very final thought here. I do know, at risk of sounding naive, I do know it's the case that not everyone has equal access to platforms. I'm very fortunate and very privileged today to be able to have this access to this platform. Not everyone has equal expectation of having their voice heard, so I do know that that's the case. But to my mind, that would always be an argument for more academic freedom, for more free speech, rather than less. I'll leave it there. So hopefully we have some time left for questions and answers. So if you just kind of give me a little wave or put your hand up, I will point to you. Yeah.
Hello. Many things are. I'll just focus on one. It does seem to me.
Oh, sorry. You have to wait for the microphone. Sorry.
It does seem to me there's a certain irony in campus protests against speakers, which is that when they're protesting end culture or Milo Yiannopoulos, they're protesting because they know exactly what those people are going to say, right? Because they've watched the YouTube video. And the people giving those talks that attract the most protest, they're sort of doing their little performance, like, I'm going to do the Milo thing. And so that raises the question, is this really about free speech, or is it really just about the right to claim some kind of legitimacy? And I wonder whether these cases are better thought of in terms of a rejection of the obligation to listen or recognize as valid, rather than free speech. I mean, in the internet era, there's no difficulty disseminating one's ideas. And the kinds of cases that have attracted the most attention, the kinds of cases you're mentioning at Berkeley, are really not cases where the individuals involved had any difficulty disseminating their ideas. In fact, the protest arose precisely because everybody knows what these people have to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you make a number of good points there, and certainly the idea that in calling for, well, in the UK we call it no platforming, here I guess it's disinvitation, is very, very much to have decided that you are outraged and offended in advance of the person actually saying what they're going to say, which yeah, is a little bit bizarre. You think, why don't you wait and hear what they've got to say and then decide whether you're outraged or not? You know, I do think there is something quite sad today, and I'm not somebody who would stand here for 1 second and defend the likes of Milo Yiannopoulos. But I think what's happened is the way that these debates have become so polarised, rather than having, and I think what's so great about this evening is the ability to have a constructive dialogue. People have been pushed to the extremes, and it's almost like, I can't imagine how these discussions work, but it's like, who can we think of who is the most offensive person, who's going to most outrage, so we can cause, and exactly as you say, kind of prompt this publicity, and every, you know, the Milo Yiannopoulos, as I've been talking to some people earlier today, you know, he wins most of all when his speech is cancelled. You know, he doesn't have to go to the effort of making a speech, and he garners far more publicity. So it's a kind of double win for him. So I think if there wasn't such a censorious climate, perhaps people who are wanting to prompt debate about free speech wouldn't feel the need to go to the absolute extremes and think who's the most offensive person we can get to speak. Anyone else? Perhaps if somebody else puts their hand up as well, then I can get the mic person to come in preparation.
Okay, so if I may speak in a different voice. So it is known, like, mathematically through voting theory, that there is an incompatibility oftentimes between liberalism and like a Pareto optimality in which everyone's preferences ranked are addressed. So with that known, do you think that there is a natural causative action between the increasing democratization of the academy and the decrease in freedom, or do you not think that there is a causative role between those two?
Sorry, I'm afraid I didn't catch the word that you said, like your kind of third or fourth word, what you were talking about. In what did you call this, a mathematical theory?
So I'm citing Amartya Sen's paper on the incompatibility between a Pareto optimality and liberalism, namely that, and it's often cited as an idea that if you have like three people and you have like, and one person wants to ban a book and two other people don't want to ban that book, then generally that person, the person who wants to ban the book, their preference, since it's so much higher than everyone else's, will often bring everyone out, will basically cause the book to be banned, even though most people don't want it. I think Nassim Taleb has been calling this the intolerance of the small minority. And I was wondering if the increasing democratization of the academy, if you think that potentially causes, if you're saying if there is a causative action between increased democratization and increased illiberalism.
Yeah, again, I think you make some very interesting points. I can't speak to the specifics of the paper. I'm afraid I've not read the specific paper that you're referring to. But I do think there are a number of interesting ideas there. I mean, this is probably me going to sound hopelessly naive here, but I think most people I've met in my life are nice people. And when debates are presented as causing offence, and particularly when the language that we use is a language of trauma and a language of psychic harm, most nice people shy away from wanting to offend, wanting to inflict psychic harm. So the to support the person who wants the book banned or just not speak out and argue in favour of keeping it is a strong urge. But I think what we do see is a real kind of polarisation, if you like, of debate, which refers to the previous question, where you end up in a way to rebel against a climate of conformity, going to the absolute extremes, which I think is very problematic. So can we get the mic at the back there? Oh, sorry. Well, and then at the back, yeah.
Yeah. So, if there is a universal truth, then that means that some ideas are just bad or wrong. How would we sort of move on from those bad or wrong ideas without sort of ruining or negating academic freedom? Because we don't want to listen to like mathematicians that say 2 + 2 is 5. So
that's a very, very good question. Okay, so I think what's really, really important about truth in relation to academic freedom is, to my mind, that even though we can talk about truth, I don't think we ever, or very, very rarely, can we say that we ever have truth that is true for all times, that we know with complete certainty, that we can put beyond all doubt whatsoever. And I think the reason why we need academic freedom is to be contesting and challenging truth claims. But of course, the danger of a relativistic position is that if we never put those truth claims forward, then we don't have anything to challenge intellectually. So we can't argue that now we've got some new knowledge and that supersedes the old knowledge, and that's how knowledge advances. It's in the act of making truth claims that we can knock them down and advance knowledge. So I think we can talk about universal truth, but I think it's really important to bear in mind that that is always going to be a contestable truth. Yeah.
So I actually have 2 questions. The first one is pertaining to what you were saying about intersectionality and your problems with it, that a person from one group is told that they can't talk over someone in another group, and that them being told to check their privilege is them being told to shut up. When someone is told that they're speaking from a place of privilege, there's difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is like feeling sorry for someone. Empathy means that you have to go to a place within yourself where, you might be in a place to understand what that kind of pain feels like, and then be helpful to a person in that situation. So to someone who doesn't have shared experiences with someone else based on their race or gender and sexuality, why is it so troubling to you that someone tells you, maybe listen and try to understand the experience more before you speak over someone else and tell them how to feel about their experiences? Why is that so offensive to you? Second question is actually about, at the bottom of the slide, it talks about your next book. And I just found some interesting things about the title, Woman versus Feminism. So towards the beginning of your talk, you defined that there are different kinds of feminism. So in this case, woman versus feminism, which feminism are you talking about? And when you talk about the gender wars, how do you define gender? Because you've been talking a lot about men and women. So in your perspective, what is gender and how many are there?
Sorry, thank you. That's a few questions there. Let me see if I can do them justice. So first of all, your very, very good point on intersectionality. I guess I have no problem at all, and I apologize if I came across wrongly in my speech. I have absolutely no problem at all with the listen part of the equation. My problem is with the shut up part of the equation, particularly if it doesn't move beyond the shut up, because my aim in life and in academia would be to try and create the space for a shared dialogue. And I think a shared dialogue would allow all parties to speak, and that would totally involve listening, but it also needs to move beyond the shutting up part. And if other people are being told to shut up, some people are being told to shut up, you need to move beyond that and actually get a conversation going. So that needs to be more than just shutting people down. On the feminism, I'm very, very happy to talk to you about that afterwards. I don't want to dominate this discussion with my next book before I kind of finish talking about my own book. But I guess, as you've probably picked up from what I have been saying today, the feminism that I'm pitching against is very much the intersectional or fourth wave feminism, and in particular the idea that women are victims and the presentation of women as victims, which I see dominating much of intersectional fourth wave feminism. And that's what I'm arguing against as being very, very unhelpful for women. So I guess I'm challenging current trends, or I'm hoping that I'm challenging current trends in feminism from a kind of pro-woman, pro-feminist perspective. So in the past, I think feminism was very much a women's liberation movement. It was about liberating women so that they could enjoy all the same freedoms and equality with men. My concern nowadays is that feminism boxes women into a corner as perpetual victims. And actually, I think there's a great deal that women have to celebrate nowadays in terms of the progress that's been made towards equality. Yeah.
This question has been submitted online. Point of reference for campus free speech here in the States tends to be Berkeley's free speech movement dating to the 1960s. What do you see in that movement that you don't see now? In what ways can they be compared, and in what ways they cannot be compared?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question, because what's ironic is that Berkeley is now, seems to be at the heart of the campus censorship movement. So it's as an institution, it's come full circle. But I guess what I see in the past is that the argument for free speech was, if I go right back to what I was saying at the beginning when I was giving my own political background, free speech, arguing for free speech, was a challenge to the establishment. It was an argument for allowing students, I mean, crucially at Berkeley, it was for allowing students to be able to participate in particular debates. It was an insistence that students be allowed to hear all kinds of political viewpoints and engage in those political dialogues. And now my fear is that it's the opposite. It's a shutting down of political debate, and it's an argument that we don't want to hear certain political arguments and viewpoints. We want, in fact, to be protected from them. So I think, tragically, we've lost the radical impetus, the demand for free speech that shaped Berkeley back in the 1960s, and it's become a retreat from politics, and a retreat into protectors rather than treat us as adults and allow us to engage in political debates. Yeah.
Hi. Indulge in a small thought experiment with me. So say you have like 10 people, they're on a ship, like the ship sink, they're on an island. So they start a small village, a small community, right? They try to establish certain rules and certain, I guess, ethical norms. And of course they go through the initial process of dialoguing and then arriving at conclusions and such, and you can imagine, like, I don't know, there are like 3 factions, whatever, like 2 factions mirroring the US politics. Would you, throughout, as time progresses, this group of people will have certain ethical assumptions, ethical values that they will no longer question, because they are sort of like, accepted things like how we accept, like, maybe don't kill other people. That's perhaps, I don't know, not a debatable ethical assertion. You use the word censorship. To what extent would you consider, whatever you call censorship, would you call them to be a reflection of unquestionable communal values, so strong and so central to the cohesion of the community that any voice that deviates from such value is just intuitively repugnant? You could label it censorship, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think you use a really key example in your thought experiment there when you talk about the ethical imperative not to kill, because of course we do kill as a society. I mean, some states here have the death penalty, and countries go to war and kill people in the process of going to war. And I think that should be debated and discussed, and you need free speech to challenge and get into discussing those issues.
Right, I'm sorry. I think I failed to get my point across. I think what I'm trying to say is that there are killings going on, but when you walk up to a random person on the street, when you say, do you think killing is wrong, 99.9% chances are that the person's going to be like, no, that's wrong, because that's just like an intuitive value that we have as almost like a global community. So I'm just saying, when you cultivate censorship, could it be seen as a positive reflection of what everybody values?
Yeah, I get it. Yeah. I mean, first of all, on the first point that you made that time, unfortunately, a lot of polls conducted in the UK, we don't have the death penalty in the UK, but unfortunately, a lot of polls do show a majority of people in support of the death penalty. So then you would argue, well, hey, we should have the death penalty, or, would I say that some things are so wrong that are so beyond the pale that they shouldn't even be discussed or up for question. And I think this is where the distinction that I was making at the beginning between words as violence and actions, physical violence, I think it's really, really important that we don't, as a society, as humanity, that we don't lose that distinction, that we keep a distinction between words and discussing and actions and practice. And there is a huge distinction between talking about killing and discussing ethical issues and carrying out these actions. And I think that is, completely fundamentally important. So right at the back there. Sorry, if you just wait for the mic.
I have a mic.
Oh, well, I'll tell you what, could we take two? And if we can take one question here and then go to the back there.
Okay.
But if it can both be quick.
Yes. Hello. First off, thanks for coming by to our small Minnesota college and talking. It's been a pleasure. Since I've had the pleasure of listening to a bunch of your insights so far, and what your thoughts are on censorship and limiting free speech, and to keep my question sort of restrained to a college environment, which is what you're speaking on. Do you think that there is a line that should be or already does exist between free speech and hate speech? And if that line does exist, what would you recommend how we deal with that, deal with the people who talk with hate speech, and should we censor them in a way, or is that bad, or just basically what do you think we should do about people with hate speech if it should be distinguished from free speech?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and particularly topical for me in the UK, where we do actually have laws against hate speech, which are being increasingly rigorously enforced, particularly on social media and social media usage, with a lot of police time that I'm sure you're aware of a kind of terrorist threat in parts of the UK at the moment. A lot of police time that I, and I'm sure others would argue, could perhaps better be spent elsewhere. But you positioned your question in the college environment, and I think what's kind of brilliant about this evening, to me this evening would be an example of college at its best, is because we can engage in a dialogue with lots of differences of opinion and lots of disagreements, but there's a level of civility here. And I think that is really important. And I think a great thing about coming to college is that you learn to confront ideas that you disagree with, and to do so with a degree of civility. And I think the best way to deal with hate speech is through free speech, and using free speech to be able to challenge and take up that. Because you can ban hate speech, but you can't ban hateful ideas. You can't make bad ideas go away you can't make prejudice go away by banning and restricting what people say. In fact, sometimes it's the opposite. You can drive them underground and prevent them from being if somebody thinks hateful things about me, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who do, I would far rather have it out in the open so I could use my free speech to be able to challenge them and hear what they think, rather than just leaving them to go away and think their hateful thoughts. Yeah.
Hi. I have a former member of my doctoral committee who recently became a major press case at Duke Divinity School by is a fairly apolitical guy who thinks that scholarship ought not to include politics, basically. I know a very unpopular position now. And found himself basically accused of a breach of Title IX for doing so, and was forced to resign, probably under duress under the circumstances. So I was wondering if it would be possible for you to comment on the way in which Title IX complicates academic freedom on campus, and what steps might be taken to further academic freedom if universities are operating within a legal context defined by Title IX.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's also, as I'm sure a number of you here are aware, a very, very topical question. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the feminist writer Laura Kipnis, who I'm somebody who I admire a great deal. She's back in the news this week because her, and you'll forgive me if I kind of get all the stages in this wrong, but her Title IX inquisition, which she was then, so she made some statement that, so she didn't, again, to come back to the distinction between words and action, she did not do anything to any student. She did not touch or have a relationship with any student, but she put out there as an argument that students should be able to have sexual relationships with academics, that this should not be considered beyond the pale, that this could be something that theoretically might happen and could happen. And for not having done anything to anyone but having put forward that argument, she was then hauled up in front of Title IX, or got on Title IX charges and investigated under that at her institution. She then wrote about it and was then investigated all over again under Title IX for having written about it. Now she's written a book which is about her investigation and her having written about it, and she's now been investigated under Title IX a third time for having written a book about having written about Title IX and having been investigated under Title IX. So yes, is the very, very short answer to your question. Title IX really does have an impact upon people's free speech on campus. And I think, I don't want to get into the whole premise of Title IX at this stage, because we were kind of too far on in the evening. But yes, it has very worrying implications for free speech, I think. Thank you.